Hey guys, I'm Ted, and I'm here to complete our lecture on emancipation. Before we begin our lecture proper on emancipation, I'd just like to touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we went over the background towards emancipation, how it was not just such an easy affair for Lincoln to do. We touched on the Republican Party and the three components within the Republican Party that made building a consensus to support emancipation difficult. We looked at the Democratic Party, the 19th century Democratic Party, that they just proved to be just a complete roadblock to any thoughts on emancipation. We also looked at 19th century American racism and how most people were in some cases just indifferent to slavery in general, and how some people were just absolutely hated African Americans. They did not want them around them in their communities or anything like that. They viewed them as competition rather than fellow citizens. They didn't want to compete with them for jobs. Didn't want any awkwardness with a formerly enslaved group living next to a group that had not been enslaved in this nation, at least. And also they feared racial amalgamation. They feared race mixing between African Americans and European Americans. And we also looked at the very ill-fated and very unfortunate event that unfolded at Île-à-Vache. Île-à-Vache was the presidential attempt at recolonization, in which 500 free men, women, and children were sent to Île-à-Vache, and the guarantees they had been promised were not provided to them, and it led to disaster. Disease swept through their ranks, and about a third of them died as a result. And really from there that we pick back up with the story of emancipation. And we begin with the military commanders. Abolitionists were not the only ones to really tackle the issue of slavery. Slaves and the military commanders in the field did so as well. Now this was tricky because at various times the United States used international law for belligerent states against the Confederate States, and at other times they treated the Confederate States as an insurrection experiment conducted by disaffected citizens of the United States. For example, blockading ports and calling secession an insurrection. So they blockaded the ports, which is something that you only do against a rival or belligerent nation. But they also called what was happening in the slave states an insurrection, meaning that this was not an independent state, but this was simply, one segment of their nation not following orders, trying to break away. Another instance would be how the United States treated captured combatants as prisoners of wars instead of holding them as rebels or traitors. And now abolitionists took the view that the Confederate States were a separate nation, and as such, international law should be applied to them. Now, Ben Franklin Butler was the first commander to apply this theory in practice. Butler was a prominent Republican. He had no noteworthy military ability, but he nonetheless held command throughout the war. He was a very popular Republican and a very well-known Republican. Not great, not known for any military ability, but definitely a political appointment for command. And he held a number of them throughout the Civil War. Now, Butler was a very astute man. He pioneered allowing black men to fight, and he was hated in the slave states for a number of reasons. One was he gave an order that in New Orleans, when he was the commander at New Orleans, he gave an order that targeted Confederate women who threw chamber pot contents at his soldiers. These women would also engage in a variety of nasty behavior toward the men. They yelled at the soldiers. They spat at the soldiers. his order stated that any woman who behaved that way, who behaved unduly towards United States soldiers in New Orleans, will be treated as women of the evening. That is, they will be treated like prostitutes. They will be manhandled. They will be arrested. You know, it was a very disgraceful thing to be treated like a prostitute in the night. Well, it still is. It still is in many segments, but it was especially damning in Southern society, and it really just turned people against Ben Franklin Butler. In May of 1861, he commanded Fort Monroe on the peninsula. When a few slaves who had been working on a nearby Confederate fortification escaped and made it to its lines. The masters of those slaves came to him and said, "Hey, you have my slave property. Give it back to me. If you're from the United States and the Fugitive Slave Act is still in effect, give me my slave property." Franklin refused. He refused to give them back to their slave masters. He termed the fugitive slaves contrabands of war. For the rest of the war, fugitive slaves who made it to the United States Army camps were known as contrabands of war. And this is actually an example of self-emancipation. They knew that if they made it to the United States Army lines, that they would not be sent back as slaves, that they would have a respite from the torments of slavery. So this is a prominent example of self-emancipation. Now, Lincoln observed it, but he didn't make any move on it. And Lincoln would have a number of reactions to what the field officers did, the orders that they gave. For example, John C. Fremont picked up where Butler left off in August of 1861. He issued a command confiscating the property of all rebels and freeing their slaves. Lincoln was horrified by what Fremont did. He thought that the order would turn the border states against the Republic. Many were upset with Lincoln in regards to this, but the response, most notably that of the radical Republicans, African Americans, and abolitionists, were really just hard on him. In many cases, deservedly so, but they were very hard on Lincoln. David Hunter, another United States commander, issued another statement freeing the slaves in his department. He commanded parts of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. He didn't really have the power to do so. Didn't really have those areas fully under his command, but he freed them. But Lincoln revoked that order as well. And Lincoln stated that only the president, had the power to issue such a broad and sweeping order. This once again led to denunciations by radicals and Republicans. The denunciations of Lincoln by radicals and Republicans. Now, the field commanders and the slaves were not really the only ones getting active in it. Congress also began to march towards emancipation. After Butler's contraband announcement, Congress passed the first Confiscation Act on August 6, 1861. This Confiscation Act confiscated the slaves of owners who were engaged in hostilities against the United States, actively helping to further the Confederate States war effort in a supporting capacity. Later in March of 1862, Congress prohibited the return of slaves who ran away from their slave owners. But you have to remember that there are Republican officers and Democratic officers in the Army. The Republican officers tended to not return slaves to their slave officers, and the Democratic officers tended to return them. A notable exception to that would be Sherman. Sherman was a Democrat. Sherman was deeply racist, but Sherman didn't return the slaves to their masters. Other Democratic officers did return slaves, runaway slaves, fugitive slaves to their masters, or simply not allow them to enter their camps, not allow them to hang around. Now, after that. After that, Congress now faced another problem. The act that they passed was problematic because it did not clear up the status of the slaves. They were not freed; they just would not be sent back to their masters. In April of 1862, Congress, while still not addressing the ambiguity surrounding the Confiscation Act, marched towards emancipation. In April of 1862, Congress abolished slavery in the District of Columbia. They did this with compensation for slave owners, but not to the slaves. And Congress continued in 1862 by emancipating all the slaves in the territories. They did this on June 19th, 1862. They emancipated all the slaves in the territories without compensation to slave masters. So we sort of see this shift and what Congress had done. They freed slave owners. They freed slaves in the District of Columbia, and they paid slave owners $300 for their slave property, but they just simply freed the slaves in the territories without any compensation for the slave masters. Now, what the act on June 19th did was they fulfilled a campaign platform point, and that was keeping slavery out of the territories. At the same time, that Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act, which was much tougher, freeing any slave that escaped from a rebel owner. Congress has now taken a definitive stance regarding emancipation, regarding freedom for slaves. The first Confiscation Act didn't really specify what was going to happen. This second one, outright freedom. You made it to the United States Army, you weren't going to be sent back, and you were going to be free. This cleared up in no uncertain ways the ambiguity associated with the first Confiscation Act. And all of these pieces, Congress is reaching towards a decision on the national level. They do it in the capital, they do it in the territories, they do it among the rebelling states, and all of these things that they're inching closer and closer towards the national level. These acts, it should be noted, did not apply to the border states or the slave masters in the Confederate states that were still loyal to the United States. And this leads us up to presidential emancipation and Lincoln's first plan. And Lincoln, at this point, Lincoln had a 5-step plan. He stepped it onto the stage, and his plan was this. His 5-step plan or 5-day plan for emancipation was this. Step 1, slavery is a domestic institution and should be abolished by the states. Step 2, or stage 2, the owners should be confiscated for the loss of their slave property. Step 3, the national government should cover part of the expense. That is, the national government should pay for should pay the bill for the compensation along with the states. Step 4, the process should be gradual to avoid social upheaval. And step 5, the freed slaves should be recolonized abroad. Lincoln went to Congress to ask for funds for compensated emancipation in the border states. Congress agreed and made the funds available, but the border states refused to come up with any blueprint for gradual emancipation. Lincoln met with the border states on a number of occasions until July of 1862, when he issued a warning that if they did not come up with the plan, he would, and his plan would be based on wartime necessities. That was a threat. That was a threat that their slaves will be freed without any compensation for them. They again refused, this time by a margin of 2-1. This led to Lincoln's decision to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He was persuaded to wait until good news came in from the battlefield. He made this decision in July of 1862, and at this point, Bobby Lee had just been whipping the army of the Potomac up and down northern Virginia. It was said that if the United States had issued it, if Lincoln had issued his statement regarding emancipation, it would have reeked of desperation. So Lincoln had to wait, and he had to wait throughout the summer, but finally Antietam provided him an opportunity. So there were many factors that motivated him to issue the preliminary order for emancipation. Number one was the recalcitrance of the remaining slave states to come up with their own emancipation plan. The ever-increasing number of contraband slaves forced him to focus on the matter more intensely. Also, a presidential statement on the matter would head off any attempt by the United Kingdom and France in the international arena. There was also an increasing belief in the United States that the rebelling slave states should be dealt with more harshly. Had the war went on, had the casualty list rose, more people in the United States came to the understanding, the belief that the Confederate States should be punished more severely for having put the nation through all of this. Enmity just rose, and from that enmity towards the rebels, this support for emancipation grew. There was no better way, it was said, to hurt the slave owners, to hurt the slave states, than to take their slaves away from them. This became the ultimate punishment. Lincoln also came to the realization that the course that he took, or the course that Congress took, no matter what course they took, it would alienate Copperhead Democrats. So he did not really stress on pleasing them so much. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation ordered the freeing of all slaves held in any portion of the United States still in rebellion against the United States government on January 1st, 1863. This was justified solely on military ground. No moral high ground, just basic military necessity. It also brought up the issue of voluntary recolonization. Lastly, there was one final offer to the remaining slave states to come up with their own emancipation settlement. This was a very conservative approach. Lincoln gave the rebel states, the Confederate states, he gave them from essentially October, November, and December, roughly about 90 days, a little more than 90 days, to come up with their own plan of action to re-enter the Union. If they did not, after a little more than 90 days, then their slaves will be freed. The final proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863, because of course none of the Confederate states accepted Lincoln's offer. They rebuffed it. They thought it was a joke. They thought it was highly hypocritical. None of them accepted it. On January 1st, 1863, all of the slaves in the rebelling slave states that were not already under United States control were freed, and I used air quotes, free, because of course the United States Army, if the United States Army was not there, that meant there was no real ability to free those slaves. And of course, for the areas already under United States control, those slaves were to remain slaves because those areas of the Confederate States under United States control were of course not in rebellion against the United States. So a lot to take in with the proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation made no distinction between loyal and disloyal slave masters in those Confederate states. Once the United States armies had reached a location and they found slaves, all the slaves were freed. The excluded areas were parts of northern Virginia that were under United States occupation, portions of Louisiana, and of course all of Tennessee, owing to Grant's victory at Chattanooga. So all of Tennessee is excluded. Lincoln exempted these areas because the United States Army, as I stated earlier, were already in control, and they were thus not in a state of rebellion against the United States government, meaning that their slaves were protected by the Constitution. The Constitution at this point still protected slavery. Now, the fact that the slaves were freed the slaves were freed only where Lincoln didn't have the power to free them was brought up, and the fact that he freed no slave where he did have the power to free them was also brought up. A tremendous amount of criticism was aimed and directed at him in the United States, in the Confederate States, and in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom. British abolitionists and British pro-slavery influences zeroed in on Lincoln because of this. This was something that really tarnished his reputation abroad and to a degree at home. Many saw it simply as an empty gesture. In the Confederate States, he was a hypocrite, of course, and even now it negatively impacts his legacy. Now, Lincoln supporters at the time and through the years have answered that the Emancipation Proclamations were war measures that were specifically aimed at the war-making capacity of the rebelling slave states. The Emancipation Proclamation added liberating the slaves to the United States officially had war aims, had a war aim. The proclamations did have an impact on the remaining slave states. For example, when West Virginia and Virginia split, West Virginia was admitted to the Republic as a free state. That was a requirement. Emancipation was a requirement for their admission. Missouri, Tennessee, and Maryland all had internal abolition movements develop after January 1st, 1863, and all would abolish slavery before the war ended. The only slave state to hold on to slavery, to not make any move towards emancipation or abolishing slavery before the war ended, was Kentucky. Kentucky resisted at all costs. Kentucky refused to make an emancipation settlement. The proclamations made the United States Army the greatest anti-slavery instrument, because wherever that army went, whenever they defeated the Confederates deep in Confederate territory, they of course brought freedom to the local slave population. Wherever they went, freedom will follow from now on. A new republic would emerge if the United States won from now on. That was what the Emancipation Proclamation promised. A new republic, a slave-free republic, a republic where slavery was abolished, would emerge should the United States won. That was the promise of the proclamations. And with that being said, we'll bring this lecture to a close. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys found it enlightening, entertaining, thought-provoking, and insightful. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know specifically what you guys thought about this lecture. And I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.